Okay, if you remember, stage 3 of photosynthesis is called the Kelvin cycle. Okay, it happens in the stroma of the chloroplast. So the first two stages happen in the thylakoids, but now we've moved out to the stroma. And so if you remember from yesterday, we looked at the fact that we have ATP and NADPH that come from the thylakoid and go to the stroma. And that's where the Kelvin cycle happens. A lot of times we call the Kelvin cycle the light independent reaction. Whereas the other two parts of photosynthesis have to have light to happen. Light is actively driving those processes, and if there's no light, they're not going to happen. The Kelvin cycle can happen even if there is no light. So they don't, we used to call them the dark reactions, but that made people think that they had to happen in the dark. Well, no, this will go on if it's light out. But the point is, you don't have to have light for the Kelvin cycle to happen. As long as there's ATP and NADPH, the Kelvin cycle will keep going. Now, of course, when those run out, then the Kelvin cycle stops. And if you don't have the light-dependent reactions, then those things aren't being made. But as long as there's kind of a store of ATP and NADPH, we can keep doing the Kelvin cycle. Or by we, I mean plants, so not us. Another name for the Kelvin cycle, or another way to describe it, is carbon fixation. So here we finally see where carbon dioxide is actually going to come in to the plant and be used. The first two parts used water, and we saw where the oxygen was released, so those are some parts that we think of when we think about photosynthesis. But the Kelvin cycle is where the carbon dioxide is actually used. All right. I'm going to turn the slide and show you a diagram of the carbon cycle. It's going to have a lot of stuff on it. Don't get too freaked out. So this is the Kelvin cycle. What happens is we have carbon dioxide right here that comes in, and this drawing it like this is just a way of organizing it. It's not like there's big arrows in the plant chloroplast or anything. But the carbon dioxide basically gets added to another molecule. Now that molecule is called 3-phosphoglycerate. Yeah, that doesn't matter. We just need to realize that carbon dioxide is added to a chain. At that point, we're going to use energy in the form of ATP and the NADPH. And of course, these, remember, come from the electron transport chain. So these are from electron transport chain. And those energy molecules are going to get used up. So energy used to change the form of that carbon molecule that we made by adding the carbon dioxide until it's into a usable form called G3P. So the energy is used to change the carbon chain to this G3P. Okay, so let's kind of take stock right there. Carbon dioxide gets added to a molecule, then energy in the form of the ATP and the NADPH that we got from the other parts of the photosynthesis in the thylakoids, they're just going to modify it. They're going to modify it in a way that it becomes this G3P molecule, because that's the thing that can then turn into glucose. Okay? But here's the important part. When that carbon dioxide molecule comes in, and actually it's 3 carbon dioxide molecules, probably should put that up here, 3 carbon dioxide molecules added to that chain, we only get 1 G3P molecule, but it takes 2 G3P molecules to make a glucose. So here we've only made basically half of a glucose. Now, from that point, there are molecules that are left over. Because here we had 6 molecules of each of these things. We've only made 1 G3P. The other 5 molecules go on, and energy is used to recycle those to the starting product, which we call rubisco. So here, energy used to recycle to the start. Okay, and so we can see why it's called a cycle. Most of the stuff in that cycle just kind of goes around and around. There's just slight changes and the addition of the carbon dioxide that end up making that G3P molecule, which can then be used to make glucose. Okay? So one time around the Kelvin cycle only makes half as much as we need to make glucose. So we actually have to do what we call 2 turns of the Kelvin cycle to get a single glucose molecule. So to kind of summarize, we put in 3 carbon dioxides. We use 6 ATP and 6 NADPH, and that gets us 1/2 glucose. But then we can't forget, we also have to use 3 ATP to turn things back around so that it can happen again. And that's kind of this would be the summary that I would want you to kind of understand. The fact that it does go around again, things get recycled. Here's where the carbon dioxide gets in. We use energy, number 1, to convert that carbon dioxide and through the molecules into half a glucose, and then we have to use ATP again to kind of recycle and restart the Kelvin cycle. So to get a full glucose molecule, we have to have 6 carbon dioxides. We would use up 12 ATP in the first step. We would use up 12 NADPH in kind of the second part there. And then to recycle it, we would have to use, both times, we would have to use a total of 6 ATP. Now, the fact that that energy is being used up there, it's not like it's wasted. That energy actually ends up being stored in the glucose. The reason why this takes energy is it takes energy to make those bonds and put this G3P together. Then later, your mitochondria can break that thing apart and get that energy back. So what we're really doing is kind of taking one type of energy source, and the ATP and the NADPH, using them to charge up a different energy source. So it'd be kind of like if you, took a bunch of AA batteries and hooked them all together to charge up your car battery. Now that sounds kind of silly, but you could do that if you hooked enough of them together. It'd take a lot of them, but if you hooked enough of them together, you could do that. And then you could then use your car battery to do whatever, or later down the road, you could use that car battery in order to charge up some of your AA batteries. Now, why would you want to do that? In the same way here, it's probably easier to store one car battery than, say, 1,500 AA batteries. In this case, it's easier to store that glucose somewhere in your body than those ATP molecules that can get used up really easily. So it's just a way of storing energy in the form of sugar. So that's the overall process of photosynthesis. That's what plants do to make sugar for themselves, and then of course we use that sugar for ourselves when we eat them, or animals eat them, or whatever. Now plants do this process in their chloroplasts. There are other organisms like bacteria that do the process a little bit differently. We're not going to study that because I think one overly complicated cycle is probably enough for you guys to learn at this point. But there are some organisms that are able to make energy without using sunlight. So this is a black smoker vent on the bottom of the ocean floor. They occur in areas that are very deep where sunlight really doesn't get to. And we thought these places were dead. We thought, nothing can live there because without sunlight, you can't have plants and organisms like that, the autotrophs, to grow. Without autotrophs, you got no heterotrophs because there's nothing to eat. So we thought these were dead places, but once we were able to actually send submersible submarines, little robot submarines, down to these black smoker vents, we found it was teeming with life. And it was weird. How are these things getting energy? There's no sunlight down there. Well, what we found is that some organisms called chemoautotrophs are able to go through a similar process to photosynthesis to make their food, but they do it in a different way. So this is a process called chemosynthesis. So in chemosynthesis, organisms make their own food, but they use chemical reactions instead. If you remember, the equation for photosynthesis is 6CO2 plus 6H2O. Add some sun, so we'll put plus light, and that gives us glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen, 6 oxygen molecules. Well, here is an equation for one of the processes by which some organisms can do chemosynthesis. And we see it is very similar. Here they're using carbon dioxide, they're using water, but instead of light, they use hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is an acidic compound that is found bubbling up through these black smoker vents. It comes from deep in the earth, in the mantle of the earth, down where there's lava, or well, not lava, magma, but there's hot compounds down there. By breaking down that hydrogen sulfide right here, they get out energy and they make sugar just the same, but here instead of releasing oxygen, they release these sulfur compounds, H2SO4, which is sulfurous acid, that is just the waste products of that overall process. Now, we don't need to know that much about this. I'm not going to ask you to write down the equation for chemosynthesis. The overall thing that you need to know is that there are some organisms that are able to make their own food without light, and that it is a similar process to photosynthesis, just they use chemicals instead of light to drive the reactions. Well, we've gone over all the parts of photosynthesis. On Monday, we'll be doing an activity to kind of summarize that and refresh our brains on the whole process. I'm sure it'll take a little bit for that to all get solidified in your head. Homework for Monday is worksheet 4.3, so make sure you get that done. Here's your question of the day.